So in the previous lesson, we spent some time talking about the Treaty of Versailles, looking at some of the key terms and the institutions that were established as the result of the treaty. In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles. So if you don't forget from the previous video, Germany wasn't invited to the Paris Peace Conference. Germany wasn't invited to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was imposed upon Germany. And so, as a result of which, you can probably imagine that their reaction to some of the terms wasn't particularly positive. And so we'll begin by looking at German reactions, and we'll then talk about the government and sort of political responses from some of the politicians that were in government at the time. So German reactions to Versailles were not positive in the slightest. The first was this idea that it was a dictated peace, a der Diktat. I want to say, for the record, by the way, as a very brief aside before we carry on with this video, that I'll apologise for any pronunciation issues that take place with some of the German words and names that we get in this video. There are some that I'm just not even going to attempt to try and pronounce because you don't need to know how to spell or know these words, but just bearing that in mind for this video. So, the concept of a dictated peace. The treaty was detested by many for being imposed upon by without any kind of negotiation, without any invite from the Allies to the German state itself. The Germans at this point had no voice in the peace talks. They had no voice in the treaty, and the treaty terms were presented to the German state as non-negotiable. The idea of diktat became a widespread phrase reflecting the contempt that was seen by as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the idea that they were dictated to, that this was a peace that was dictated to them and it wasn't something that they had any control over. In terms of specific reactions, their attitude towards the war guilt clause, clause 231, was very much the focus of a lot of this attention. So Article 231 forces Germany to accept responsibility for causing the war. This was seen as a deep affront to national honour and to national pride. The Germans overwhelmingly rejected the blame. They also perceived this as a kind of victor's justice. So essentially, it was the people who won the First World War who get to dictate what counts as justice for the war beginning. So they didn't believe it to be accurate historical judgment. This wasn't an accurate historical representation of what happened. This was just the victors imposing these terms onto those who had been to those who had lost the war, essentially. Another issue, of course, was the fact that with the war guilt clause that was dictated to them, the Germans had to pay reparations. They had to pay reparations as a logical result of being responsible for the war itself. These reparations were not only economically crippling, but they were also symbolically degrading. The required payments was eventually set in 1921 to a total of 132 billion gold marks, triggering severe economic instability. You don't have to know about this in any great detail for this particular module, but one of the things that happens almost immediately after the reparations payments begins is they fall behind on the reparations payments, and the French and Belgian troops, French and Belgian military, in response to that, invade and occupy the Ruhr, which is a sort of industrial heartland of Germany. This then causes the German government to have to print lots and lots of money to try and pay for the reparations, which results in something known as hyperinflation. Essentially, inflation is something that you hear about in economics, where the value of currency begins to decrease if you have more of that thing, or more of that currency in circulation. And so if you just keep printing and printing and printing and printing and printing money, the value of that money becomes less and less and less compared to other currencies. And it got to a point where you would you would have to go to the shops to buy bread, and it would cost you billions and billions and billions of marks, of gold marks, and you have to carry the money in wheelbarrows and all this kind of thing. So that's one of the things that happens as a result of reparations. It requires the issuance of a new currency and the establishment of a number of plans to try and manage the reparations in 1924, 1925. These are known as the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, that are named after the people who essentially provide them. Charles Dawes was an American economist. What about the attitudes towards other issues? So, for example, the territorial losses. Of course, this was a major issue. They were stripped of a massive amount of territory. Around 7 million people were affected by this stripping of territory. But also the disarmament. They were forbidden to rearm, and they had no right to a strong defence. These terms sort of spurred feelings of vulnerability and resentment, and were viewed as a deliberate effort to weaken Germany on a permanent basis. This is problematic because one of the things that was a real issue is that France and Belgium occupies the Ruhr. They invade the Ruhr in 1923, I believe it is. And so this felt like an issue where they were able to essentially do whatever they wanted to Germany, and Germany had no way of maintaining any kind of military response and self-defense. There's also the fact that there is isolation taking place. They are not only militarily weakened, they are not only economically weakened, their territories have not only been stripped, but they are isolated diplomatically. They are not allowed to join the League of Nations. They have no real allies in the world. These kinds of parts of the treaty and of the sort of European reaction changes ever so slightly over time. They become they sign greater agreements with other countries. They eventually join the League of Nations, but at least for now they are diplomatically isolated. All of this results in a political fallout, and there are sort of narratives that are beginning to take shape. The first is this idea of the idea that it was the elites within the German military and within the German government that stabbed the country in the back. This becomes known as the stab in the back myth. The idea that they betrayed, a narrative of betrayal becomes a very key insight into the German nation. The idea here is that they were betrayed by socialist or by democratic leaders who signed the peace agreement, even though in reality Germany was never going to win the First World War. They were militarily exhausted. This myth, this propaganda that they were actually going to win the war, or that they were doing just fine in the war, and that it was these leaders that were democratic leaders or socialist leaders, sometimes even eventually, as time goes on, these stab in the back myths become quite anti-Semitic. They are sort of portrayed as Jews stabbing Germany in the back, and of course that becomes a very important feature of the rise of Hitler and Nazism. The people who signed these agreements were dubbed the November Criminals. This was a politically potent argument, and it does lead to the rise of quite a lot of extremism on both the far right and on the far left in the early period of the Weimar Republic. The sort of social democrats vie for control, and there are a number of attempts to try and stage a revolution from both the far right and from the far left, from the communists and from the fascists. In terms of the sort of government at the time, the person who was the head of the government was Philipp Scheidemann. Scheidemann famously resigned rather than to sign the treaty, condemning it as a horrific and murderous witch's hammer. So he wasn't particularly fond of the treaty himself. The German foreign minister, who was actually at Versailles, but not allowed to actually involve himself in any negotiations, was Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau. He was the German foreign minister, and he delivered a scathing protest, declaring that accepting such terms would be akin to signing the death sentence of many millions of German men, women, and children. So these two were not particularly fond of it. We also see the response from somebody who was a little bit more pragmatic, Friedrich Ebert. Friedrich Ebert was the first president of the Weimar Republic, the new Weimar Constitution. He recognized that Germany was in a very precarious position. He also recognized that refusal to sign the Treaty of Versailles, like had been proposed by Brockdorff, Rantzau, and by Scheidemann, would result in or risks the Allied invasion. It risks the picking up of the First World War and resulting in an occupation of the German state. And so, under the weight of this military threat, Friedrich Ebert's government reluctantly accepted the terms of the treaty and signed the Treaty of Versailles.